When it comes to individual categories of antibiotics, our textbook contains several tables, and those start on page 70 and go to page 71, and then several pages over we'll have some more tables that talk about the general categories of antibiotics, and that's the best way to sort our antibacterial medications is by antibiotic category. Of course, I found this picture about, cold or flu, antibiotics won't help, and taking them for a virus is not going to do anything except lead to the growing problem of antibiotic resistance. So hopefully that message will start getting across more and more as time goes on. So the first category of antibiotics we're going to talk about is discussed on page 68. The text covers it on page 68, and table 5.1 lays it all out in on page 70. I included a link for an article that I thought was very interesting, and it talked about the development of penicillin as a result of venereal disease treatment during World War II. Now, of course, we call them sexually transmitted infections now. They used to be sexually transmitted diseases, and when I was younger, it was just VD. You don't want to get VD. During World War II, which started for the United States in the 1940s, 1941 with the invasion of Pearl Harbor, had already been going on for a number of years in Europe. And so there were a lot of European armies fighting, many countries being invaded, many men being killed, and syphilis was already a worldwide problem anyway and had been for eons. And unfortunately, a lot of women who were left as widows by the war in Europe were having to turn to prostitution to support their families, and this was spreading syphilis even further. So by the time our United States military had gotten over there, syphilis was becoming a huge problem and was responsible for laying up a lot of men who were otherwise able-bodied and could have been out fighting. At that particular time, syphilis was not an easily treated drug, and the use of mercury in various funnels and tubes was used, and men were having to stay in the hospitals for quite a long time. And so penicillin was eventually developed as part of this. In reality, penicillin had been discovered several decades before by a scientist named Alexander Fleming. He was a Scotsman working in England, and he was working on something else. And if you notice this picture, Alexander Fleming might have been brilliant, but he was no housekeeper, and they didn't have the protective equipment that they did back then, the hoods and the negative pressure rooms. And so he was testing something, and he'd put a number of pathogens onto slides, which you can see over here. And he had to go away on holiday, and so he lined up all these slides in a sunny window, expecting them to grow. And the window was left open, and many little fungus spores came in through the window. Well, unknown to him, they were a fungus called penicillium, and they floated down onto his test tubes. And when he came back, or his petri dishes, and when he came back, this is what they found. We had a normal bacterial colony, this penicillium spore that had fallen onto the slide, and a huge area where the growth of the bacteria was inhibited. So Fleming looked at this and it was like, that's interesting, but he didn't really do anything with it. He worked on it on the side for a number of years, and it wasn't until the 1940s, when we had the war with all the wartime injuries plus this huge problem with syphilis, that some other doctors, Doctors Chain and Flory, and some medical students started working on a way to isolate this penicillium and use it on certain pathogens. And at the time, they could only grow small amounts of it. So it was the U.S. Army that saw this problem with all these able-bodied young men being treated for syphilis and said, you know, let's get the Army on it and see how we can grow it in big vats instead of just little petri dishes. And so it was discovered and released in the years of and after World War II, which was finished by about 1945. So for years, penicillin, and in several forms, was the main antibiotic, the main broad spectrum antibiotic, and it was literally considered to be a miracle drug. Because up to this time, you know, if you were in a war and you took a mini ball to your upper arm, there wasn't a whole lot they could do for you except chop that arm off when the gangrene set in. And this had been going on for eons. So it's amazing to think that medications that could kill these harmful bacteria have only been available in the time of our parents and grandparents and some of your great-grandparents, but the 1940s, and that's not all that long ago. Plenty of people born in the 1940s are still living and can remember a period of time when there was no penicillin. My mom, born in 1940, had scarlet fever as a small child, 4 or 5 years old. No penicillin available for her. Fortunately, she recovered with no problems, but that was not the case for a lot of people. So penicillin was literally a miracle drug and saved people who otherwise would not have been saved. And for a while anyway, before antibiotic resistance, syphilis was kind of wiped out after killing whole civilizations for years and years and years. They had a way to fight it. So it was truly amazing when penicillins came out. Well, what penicillins do is they interfere with the bacterial cell wall. The cell wall is extremely important to bacteria. That's what keeps it alive and functioning. It's also what allows them to divide and replicate easily. So if you cannot create a strong cell wall, or when the cell wall is breached and it cannot be repaired, you know, it's bye-bye bacteria. So penicillin prevents the bacteria from using enzymes that are needed to produce a strong cell wall, and it's considered mostly bactericidal. It is the broad spectrum drug of choice for years for gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria. But since the 1940s, when it was first available, early 1950s, it has been overused on bacteria that is not susceptible to it. And so it has caused problems too, caused as many problems as it has solved in a lot of cases. One of the things that happened was bacteria has an uncanny ability to mutate quickly in response to changes. And so once these bacteria were exposed to various penicillins, they developed an enzyme that was secreted around the bacterial cell wall. This enzyme was called penicillinase, so ASE. We know that's an enzyme. And if a bacteria was able to create penicillinase, that destroyed the penicillin that came in contact with the bacteria. And so all of a sudden, we were seeing the first penicillin-resistant strains of bacteria, and scientists had to revisit the penicillins and come up with some penicillins that were penicillinase resistant. And so this isn't listed in your book, but you could write them in if you want. A few of those penicillinase resistant penicillins were oxacillin and nafcillin, so OXICILLIN and NAFCILLIN. I think a cloxacillin too, CLOXacillin. So those were several that they came up with that were able to resist that enzyme, that penicillinase enzyme. We use them on numerous organisms, including Group A, beta hemolytic strep, which causes strep throat and different scarlet fevers. We also use it for prophylactic treatment for patients who have infections that are attacking their heart. On page 69, you see a whole list of pathogens that penicillin is active against and have saved many lives. But like I said, it's overused, and allergies can occur suddenly or after the patient has been taking penicillin for some years. So you never ever want to just take it lightly because it's a common allergen.